Elevated, I guess.
Yeah, I want to read you something. Oh, is that a sandfly? I don't know. I want to read you something from Sapiens. One of my Holy Trinity books. Do you have a Holy Trinity of books? You don't? No, I do. But
this Trinity means three, so
yeah.
Is that all you have? Is 3 books that you...
I have my Holy Trinity, my 3-man weave, you know, my 3 musketeers.
4.
Huh?
There are 4.
For you, there are 4? Oh, there are 4 musketeers. I didn't know. But let me see if I can find it. This is a story about how humans came to go from hunter-gatherers to farmers. Who domesticated who? You know? Because as it turns out, conditions for farmers tend to be on average a lot worse than conditions for hunter-gatherers. So why did it happen? How did it happen? You know, what were the mechanics? When did it happen? We know when, and now we get to know why.
What, turn of the century?
What? 100 years ago? That's when humans became farmers?
No, the other way around. They went away from the farm.
That's not what I'm talking about. When did humans first start farming and why? Because farming is way worse of a lifestyle than hunter-gathering, for most. But not for societies, as it turns out. Yeah, why?
No more nomadic.
Because if I was a farmer, and earlier in my life I'd been a hunter-gatherer, if I got to experience both of those lifestyles in my lifetime, I'd find it easy to choose. You know, who wants to be working year-round trying to protect your crops from bugs, from predators, from other people, from competing tribes, when you could just be a hunter-gatherer, you know, collecting nuts and animals and having, you know, just having, and plus nutrition-wise, you know, if you're farming at first, you're not getting nearly as good nutrition as if you're having all those mushrooms and those nuts and those roots and those shoots and those animals.
Well, maybe it was a security for them because they knew that they could count on the earth at that specific time in that specific location, so they decided that's where we're going to stay because we can rely on this, and it's good earth, it's good.
But how did they even find out
location?
that farming should be a thing? If
Well,
no one's
they
ever
didn't.
farmed,
They
didn't, right? What happened? See,
They grew dependent.
the reason but how? You know, that when you can understand, the mechanics of it, the way it happens, maybe you can understand better how we fall into traps in modern societies. You know, it's like an addiction. How do we do these things? It's very easy to see it in history. It's very hard to internalize those steps into observing society as it goes and seeing how we might be doing it in ways today. You know,
So many
the metaphor of farming and how we fell into it and why it became something that took over, despite the fact that most people were worse off with that lifestyle, is very important to understand for trying to understand how societies move and change. So let me find it. The agricultural revolution. History's biggest fraud.
The girls are best.
All right, ready?
So what do you want me to do?
So I'm gonna sit. You find a good spot to film me from. Make sure it looks good.
Taping this for 4 minutes.
Yeah. So
Yeah, this is good.
it is with the chair.
Yeah, she's gonna come back in the chair.
Okay. So let me try to find it. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna start reading. So.
You shush. Don't shush me.
Okay, listen to the story. Scholars once proclaimed that the agricultural revolution was a great leap forward for humanity. They told a tale of progress fueled by human brain power. Evolution gradually produced ever more intelligent people.
No way.
Eventually, people were so smart that they were able to decipher nature's secrets, enabling them to tame sheep and cultivate wheat. As soon as this happened, they cheerfully abandoned the grueling, dangerous, and often Spartan life of hunter-gatherers, settling down to enjoy the pleasant, satiated life of farmers. That tale is a fantasy. There's no evidence that people became more intelligent with time. Foragers knew the secrets of nature long before the agricultural revolution, since their survival depended on an intimate knowledge of the animals they hunted and the plants they gathered. Rather than heralding a new era of easy living, the agricultural revolution left farmers with lives generally more difficult and less satisfying than those of foragers. Hunter-gatherers spent their time in more stimulating and varied ways, and they were less in danger of starvation and disease. The agricultural revolution certainly enlarged the sum of total food at the disposal of humankind, but the extra food did not translate into a better diet or more leisure. Rather, it translated into population explosions and pampered elites. The average farmer worked harder than the average forager and got a worse diet in return. The agricultural revolution was history's biggest fraud. Who was responsible? Neither kings, nor priests, nor merchants. The culprits were a handful of plant species, including wheat, rice, and potatoes. These plants domesticated Homo sapiens, rather than vice versa. Think for a moment about the agricultural revolution from the viewpoint of wheat. 10,000 years ago, wheat was just a wild grass, one of many, confined to a small range in the Middle East. Suddenly, within just a few short millennia, it was growing all over the world. According to the basic evolutionary criteria of survival and reproduction, wheat has become one of the most successful plants in the history of the earth. In areas such as the Great Plains of North America, where not a single wheat stalk grew 10,000 years ago, you can go today and walk for hundreds upon hundreds of kilometers without encountering any other plant. Worldwide, wheat covers about 2.25 million square kilometers of the globe's surface, almost 10 times the size of Britain. How did this grass turn from insignificant to ubiquitous? Wheat did it by manipulating Homo sapiens to its advantage. This ape had been living a fairly comfortable life hunting and gathering until about 10,000 years ago, but then began to invest more and more effort cultivating wheat. Within a couple of millennia, humans in many parts of the world were doing little from dawn to dusk other than taking care of wheat plants. It wasn't easy. Wheat demanded a lot from them. Wheat didn't like rocks and pebbles, so sapiens broke their backs clearing fields. Wheat didn't like sharing its space, water, and nutrients with other plants, so men and women labored long days weeding under the scorching sun. Wheat got sick, so sapiens had to keep a watch out for worms and blight. Wheat was defenseless against other organisms that liked to eat it, from rabbits to locust swarms, so the farmers had to guard and protect it. Wheat was thirsty, so humans lugged water from springs and streams to water it. Its hunger even impelled sapiens to collect animal feces to nourish the ground in which wheat grew. The body of Homo sapiens had not evolved for such tasks. It was adapted to climbing apple trees and running after gazelles, not to clearing rocks and carrying water buckets. Human spines, knees, necks, and arches paid the price. Studies of ancient skeletons indicate that the transition to agriculture brought about a plethora of ailments, such as slipped discs, arthritis, and hernias. I'm going to adjust my posture. Moreover, The new agricultural tasks demanded so much time that people were forced to settle permanently next to their wheat fields. This completely changed their way of life. We did not domesticate wheat. It domesticated us. The word domesticate comes from the Latin domus, which means house. Who's the one living in a house? Not the wheat. It's the sapiens. How did wheat convince Homo sapiens to exchange a rather good life for a more miserable existence? What did it offer in return? It did not offer a better diet. Remember, humans are omnivorous apes who thrive on a wide variety of foods. Grains made up only a small fraction of the human diet before the agricultural revolution. A diet based on cereals is poor in minerals and vitamins, hard to digest, and really bad for your teeth and your gums. And I meant to say vitamins, sorry. Wheat did not give people economic security. The life of a peasant is less secure than that of a hunter-gatherer. Foragers relied on dozens of species to survive, and could therefore weather difficult years without stocks of preserved food. If the availability of one species was reduced, they could gather and hunt more of other species. Farming societies have, until very recently, relied for the great bulk of their calorie intake on just a small variety of domesticated plants. In many areas, they relied on just a single staple, such as wheat, potatoes, or rice. If the rains failed, or clouds of locusts arrived, or even a fungus learned how to infect that staple species, peasants died by the thousands and millions. Nor could wheat offer security against human violence. The early farmers were at least as violent as their forager ancestors, if not more so. Farmers had more possessions and needed land for planting. The loss of pasture land to raiding neighbors could mean the difference between subsistence and starvation, so there was much less room for compromise. When a foraging band was hard-pressed by a stronger rival, it could usually move on. It was difficult and dangerous, but it was feasible. When a strong enemy threatened an agricultural village, retreat meant giving up fields, houses, and granaries. In many cases, this doomed the refugees to starvation. Farmers, therefore, tended to stay put and fight to the bitter end. Many anthropological and archaeological studies indicate that, in simple agricultural societies with no political frameworks beyond village and tribe, human violence was responsible for about 15% of deaths, including 25% of male deaths. In contemporary New Guinea, violence accounts for 30% of male deaths in one agricultural tribal society, the Dani, and 35% in another, the Enga. In Ecuador, perhaps 50% of all human Guaranis meet a violent death at the hands of another human. 50%. In time, human violence was brought under control through the development of larger social frameworks, cities, kingdoms, and states. But it took thousands of years to build such large and effective political structures. Village life certainly brought the first farmers some immediate benefits, such as better protection against wild animals, rain, and cold. Yet for the average person, the disadvantages probably outweigh the advantages. This is hard for people in today's prosperous societies to appreciate. Since we enjoy affluence and security, and since our affluence and security are built on foundations laid by the agricultural revolution, we assume that the agricultural revolution was a wonderful improvement. Yet it is wrong to judge thousands of years of history from the perspective of today. That's very important. A much more representative viewpoint is that of a 3-year-old girl dying from malnutrition in 1st century China because her father's crops have failed. Would she say, "I'm dying from malnutrition, but in 2,000 years people will have plenty to eat and live in big air-conditioned houses, so my suffering is a worthwhile sacrifice. No. What then did wheat offer agriculturalists, including that malnourished Chinese girl? This is a really, really important question. It offered nothing for people as individuals, yet it did bestow something upon Homo sapiens as a species. Cultivating wheat provided much more food per unit of territory, and thereby enabled Homo sapiens to multiply exponentially. Around 13,000 BC, when people fed themselves by gathering wild plants and hunting wild animals, the area around the oasis of Jericho in Palestine could support at most one roaming band of about 100 relatively healthy and well-nourished people. Around 8500 BC, when wild plants gave way to wheat fields, the oasis supported a large but cramped village of 1,000 people, who suffered far more from disease and malnourishment. So you should think about it kind of the way you think about livestock. Who do you think has a better existence? The wild buffalo we saw yesterday in Lunenburg, is it Lunenburg? What's that small town? Bridgewater. There's like 6 buffalo, and they live way better. If a buffalo could choose between their life and the life of any cow or bovine in industrial farming, which life would they choose? It's easy, right? But it's more about which one spreads. Unfortunately, with evolution, it's always about which one spreads.
It's also about money. Which one gains?
Well, in human terms, yeah, it's about money. Money is the currency of human power, but population is the currency of genetic power, of species power. And so if I'm a hunter-gatherer tribe, maybe I live better. But if there's a farmer tribe beside me, they might have worse lives as groups. But if they can stay together as one cohesive group, if they form the religions or the beliefs or the power structures to do that, to survive as a group and to want to spread as a group, then they're unstoppable compared to me, because they want to spread. They want to grow in numbers, and they have the numbers. They have the tools now. They have the structures to take me over, to amalgamate or kill me. And so, it's the whole history is written by the victors thing. We might be skewed into thinking that it was a natural progression from hunter-gathering to agriculture, but it sucked for individuals. It just worked out well for populational memes, for populations, one against the other. Which one's going to win, I have way more than you. And so even though on a daily basis I'm more miserable than you, if I added up all the suffering in my life, it might be, and the hunger and the infighting and all that stuff, it might be worse than yours as a hunter-gatherer, but I can take you over, and I want to. And so that's what dominates in the end. But it's not over. The currency of evolution is neither hunger nor pain, but rather copies of DNA helixes. Just as the economic success of a company is measured only by the number of dollars, this is what we were talking about, in its bank account, not by the happiness of its employees, so the evolutionary success of a species is measured by the number of copies of its DNA. If no more DNA copies remain, the species is extinct, just as a company without money is bankrupt. And in the same way, if no more copies of a population that has a certain culture and a certain, lifestyle, if no more of those exist, then that culture is dead, not just those genes. Those genes might be similar to the genes of the agriculturalists, but the culture is gone forever, right? So the spread of culture is contingent in many ways upon the spread of DNA, not fully, but if I destroy you, then not just your DNA is gone, your culture is gone. If I assimilate you, your DNA stays, but your culture is gone. Your lifestyle is gone. The way your better lifestyle is gone. And same for companies, actually. If Google buys a small startup that has great ideas, but is fine with getting bought out because all their founders are humans and they want their short term, it's way easier to get bought out. You do pretty well. You had a good run. Then all that potential of that company, some might be kept, but it's very contingent on Google. If Google just wants to buy you because you're a competitor, then whatever you had to offer as competition is, some might sift through to Google, most won't, So it's the same at all levels of this. If a species boasts many DNA copies, it is a success, and the species flourishes. From such a perspective, 1,000 copies are always better than 100 copies. This is the essence of the agricultural revolution. The ability to keep more people alive under worse conditions. Same for agriculture again. And I'm noticing something. This is kind of cool. I'm noticing when I'm reading, and then when I'm going back to talk to you, the shift back to reading is tough, because reading is it's like reciting, right? It's not talking really. It's more robotic. And so to make the reading organic, and it takes a while to sit back into it. And so you have to, I'm sure as I do more of this, if I end up reading stuff and recording stuff, the transition back and forth from reading to talking is kind of tricky, especially from talking to reading. Yes, why?
You have to cite by memory, perhaps.
But that's also recitation. I have to cite the story by memory.
Yeah.
So if I was to resume the story here, it's that you don't have to. It can get worse for individuals and yet still take over as a way of living. That's the interesting thing. And it gets more interesting, you'll see, because you have to imagine, okay, if I'm an individual and within my lifetime I see my parents had a way better life and I have a way worse life as a farmer, obviously I would go back. But it gets more interesting when you consider time, it creeps in. It's slow and it's subtle. You don't go from hunting all the time to farming all the time, because if you're used to hunting, if your whole culture is about hunting, you might start first with, if you're in a very tough situation in the winter, you'll start realizing that some plants grow in one space in the summer and you can consistently count on them. So you'll keep going back to that spot every year. And at some point, you'll find that, if you kill other plants in that spot, then more of your plants will grow. If you water those plants, if you protect those plants in different ways, generation by generation, you add layers of farming. Farming is not done overnight. Unlikely it is. These days we're so used to very quick adoption of things. Smartphones come in 2008, and here we are at 2019, and everyone's got a smartphone. Those people over there have a smartphone. I have one, or I did until I lost it yesterday. And that's exponential. But exponents start off slow, and they can take generations to build up. And in farming, and the slower they are, I'd say, it's kind of lucky actually that we have older generations. Like even me, I didn't start off with a smartphone in my life. It's kind of lucky we have generations that, lived well into their adulthood without phones, without computers, because they can, it's this whole concept about generational theory. The generational theory is the idea that the conditions that you grew up in your generation, your particular generation, are so specific. The wars, the movements, the technologies that came up when you were growing up or when you became an adult or when you were old, regardless, they leave you with a certain, not genetic, but neurological brain. You know, people that grew up in the Cold War are way more afraid of communism by definition. By definition, it's scary because you lived the fear of having to hide under tables for nuclear tests, you know, for bomb alerts and bomb practices. Like, I've never done that. And so I'll be way more predisposed to, yeah, it could be a problem. And the other thing about generational theory is the further back the thing happened that was so influential to whoever those people were, the further back it is, the less you can relate to it. If it happened to my grandparents, I can relate to it less than if it happened to my parents. And the other thing about generational theory is that it's exponential when technology comes into play, meaning that for farmers, you know, this is why I say we're lucky that in a sense, we're lucky that it's exponential now, because it may make it way harder for us as people to adapt to it. But we have way more reference points for times, for periods. You know, if there was a 1,000-year period where people went from not farming to farming, then I have no chance of realizing what I'm falling into. But if there's a 10-year period or a 50-year period between cell phones are non-existent and cell phones are ubiquitous, then we'll pay way more attention to any problems they might cause. You know, there's no, if cell phones took 1,000 years to take hold, then it would be so subtle that the human brain, because we all each only live 100 years, we wouldn't be able to intuit any problems or any opportunities from them. And so whatever you're brought up in your time becomes the story you tell. And not just the story, but that's what the world looks like. And so everything after, it's both an advantage and a disadvantage. Because people right now who never went through any war and who are now leading countries, you know, they don't know what it's like to be at war and leading a country. They've never had that experience. And so they're playing these games, Trump and, you know, Kim Jong-un. I heard this example, you know, they never went through war, but here they are playing at war, and so they don't know how to deal with it. It's not part of their experience set. But at the same time, if you do go through it, then your whole experience is based off that. I look at my grandfather, Jajo, you know, I don't know if Papa told you this, but you know how when they were young and they were all hippies, and they were always trying to convince their parents that, like, Jajo always voted conservative, right? So why? And it's because of that fear of liberal equals communist, because that's what it meant in his days, is if you were on the left, you were going to go for communism. And so forevermore, you're set in that mindset. And that can help you avoid, it's like an adaptation. The more flexible your adaptations, the more flexible your mindsets, the more you're likely to survive and thrive as either an individual or as a collective. And so if I get stuck, you know, most people do. It's not if, it's how much. I know that I'm going to get stuck in a certain way of seeing the world based on what was formative in my youth and in my adolescence and in my young adulthood. You know, that's when the brain forms, especially in your youth. And so whatever trauma or whatever was instrumental to the story you tell about yourself in those times, the good and the bad of that story, that's what the world is going to look like to you, for better and for worse. And it's a question of how much are you set in that? How much are you bound to that? How much can you realize how you do that? And how much can you, the more you realize how deeply you're invested in a certain way of looking at the world based on what you came up in, the more you have a chance of inventing or looking into practices that can break the mold a bit or a lot. And that's key. it's going to become more and more key as the world changes faster and faster. But in farming times, to go back to that, the world was a bit slower. So the question is, why should individuals care about this evolutionary calculus? That's the real question here. Why would any sane person lower his or her standard of living just to multiply the number of copies of the Homo sapiens genome? Nobody agreed to this deal. The agricultural revolution was a trap. And you have traps in your life, and so maybe listening to this one can help you find yours. Let's see if it can. The rise of farming was a very gradual affair spread over centuries and millennia. A band of Homo sapiens gathering mushrooms and nuts and hunting deer and rabbits did not, all of a sudden, settle into a permanent village, plowing fields, sowing wheat, and carrying water from the river. The change proceeded by stages, each of which involved just a small alteration in daily life. Homo sapiens reached the Middle East around 70,000 years ago. Flourished there without agriculture. The natural resources of the area were enough to support its human population. In times of plenty, people had a few more children, and in times of few, a few less. Humans, like many mammals, have hormonal and genetic mechanisms that help control procreation. In good times, females reach puberty earlier, and their chances of getting pregnant are a bit higher. In bad times, puberty is late and fertility decreases. To these natural population controls were added cultural mechanisms. Babies and small children who move slowly and demand more attention were a burden on nomadic foragers. People tried to space their children 3 to 4 years apart. Women did so by nursing their children round the clock until a late age. Around-the-clock suckling significantly decreases the chances of getting pregnant. Other methods, including full or partial sexual abstinence, backed perhaps by cultural taboos, abortions, and occasionally infanticide, were practiced. During these long millennia, people occasionally ate wheat grain, but this was a marginal part of their diet. About 18,000 years ago, the last ice age gave way to a period of global warming. As temperatures rose, so did rainfall. The new climate was ideal for Middle Eastern wheat and other cereals, which multiplied and spread. People began eating more wheat, and in exchange, they inadvertently spread its growth. Since it was impossible to eat wild grains without first winnowing, grinding, and cooking them, people who gathered these grains carried them back to their temporary campsites for processing. This is important. They carried them back. Wheat grains are small and numerous, so some of them inevitably fell on the way to the campsite and were lost. Over time, more and more wheat grew along favored human trails and near campsites. Think about that. When humans burned down forests and thickets, this also helped wheat. Fire cleared away trees and shrubs, allowing wheat and other grasses to monopolize the sunlight, water, and nutrients. So you see, it doesn't have to be conscious. Humans do all sorts of shit all the time. They just burn forests, and they're hunting, maybe they're burning them to hunt out animals, and in the process, they're making space for more wheat. Where wheat became particularly abundant, and game and other food sources were also plentiful, human bands could gradually give up their nomadic lifestyle and settle down in seasonal and even permanent camps. So more food means I can stay there longer. And staying there longer means I end up spreading more food, and I end up burning more forest around there. So it's self-reinforcing. It's a positive feedback loop. At first, they might have camped for 4 weeks during harvest. A generation later, as wheat plants multiplied and spread, the harvest camp might have lasted for 5 weeks, then 6, and finally it became a permanent village. This would have taken a long time, but time was all they needed. Evidence of such settlements has been discovered throughout the Middle East, particularly in the Levant, where the Natufian culture flourished from 12,500 BC to 9,500 BC. The Natufians were hunter-gatherers who subsisted on dozens of wild species, but they lived in permanent villages and devoted much of their time to the intensive gathering and processing of wild cereals. They built stone houses and granaries. They stored grain for times of need. They invented new tools such as stone scythes for harvesting wild wheat and stone pestles and mortars to grind it. In the years following 9500 BC, the descendants of the Natufians continued to gather and process cereals, but they also began to cultivate them in more and more elaborate ways. When gathering wild grains, they took care to lay aside part of the harvest to sow the fields next season. They discovered that they could achieve better results by sowing the grains deep in the ground rather than haphazardly scattering them on the surface. So again, it doesn't have to be intentional. It's kind of like genes. Genes are mutations. Mutations are cancer. They're random, and most of the times they're damaging. They end up killing you. Same thing for cultural adaptations. Most new behaviors aren't that useful, and so some random dude with a bit of mental problems might, plant them deeper, or someone might just do it by accident, and then they discover they're doing way better. And then suddenly the whole tribe is worshiping that person, and the person is trying to figure out what the hell they did, and if they can repeat it, then it catches on and it spreads, just like genes. Oh yeah? So what do you think about that?
It's interesting.
For me, the way it's interesting is, I'm trying to think about, I know as a person, this happens on the individual level as much as it happens on the group level. And it happens on much smaller timescales as much as on bigger timescales, especially with individuals who can change pretty quickly compared to whole groups. What if it's a snowball effect, and it's like a consensual matrix that you build. So for me, I think one of them, and some of these are good, by the way. These aren't all just bad behaviors or problematic behaviors. Otherwise, why wouldn't the good ones catch on? The point is the bad ones can also catch on if they serve their purpose. If they're addictive, or so on the individual level, the bad ones can catch on if they're addictive. So for example, I know when I started at the end of first year university, second year, I started watching a lot of YouTube because the term had ended and everything went wrong at once. And so it all fed into each other, I didn't get a co-op job when I really wanted one. I hardly even knew how to try for a job. And when I didn't get one, I was still surprised and shocked and, dismayed. Not even, I was just shocked. I don't know, I wasn't shocked, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to act. And meanwhile, like a bunch of other things were going wrong, and then I started watching a lot of YouTube. And it's funny how that goes both ways, because at first it was really problematic. Remember when I was at your house for like those 2 weeks at Christmas time?
Yep.
And I was just in my room watching YouTube 14 hours a day. No kidding, like 2 shifts of work of YouTube every day. That's what I was doing. It's hard to even eat. It's crazy. And it's crazy how quickly it catches on, but I guess it makes it's harder to spot it when, brevity is a blind spot. When everything changes really quickly, you're tumbled around. It's like falling into an ocean or into some rapids when you're whitewater rafting. Most people don't have the clarity or the presence, especially if it's going badly. You don't want the presence. So you don't have the presence to notice what's happening and what you're turning into and what your time is turning into. And so you don't even know what you're doing until you get out of it. And how do you get out of it? But when I said it's crazy how it goes both ways, what I mean by that is some of those addictions, if you survive them, they can become super telling. Like they can, if you start, that's the beauty of self-consciousness. It can be a problem to be so self-conscious, but it can also, it's the upside of that is, if you learn to use self-consciousness or just presence, consciousness, you end up learning how to understand yourself through the lens, the amplifiers of your addictions, of your weaknesses, of the times in your life where you've just fallen into the rapids. And it's like it's like a microscope. It lets you see, or it's like Dutch Blitz, that card game Dutch Blitz. It lets you see things about the way you behave maybe not in a controlled context in this case, but if you survive it, and if you look back on it with more than just fear of repetition, you have a chance of understanding yourself and your condition much better. And I know that like we all get addicted in personal ways. There's nothing. The reason we ban drugs or addictive substances is because they tend to addict more people. But there's nothing saying that they're the only addictive things. Everyone's addicted to their own things. And I guess by looking back at that, I can see exactly, or every time it happens, I see with more frame rate, with more resolution, I see the mechanics of what gets me into problematic addictions. Oh, most addictions are problematic. Actually, all, if they're just addictions, addiction is problematic. If I get addicted to work, because addiction is lack of balance. That's all it is. If I'm a workaholic, I'm just out of balance. There's nothing wrong with work. It's just when I'm teaching full time and then taking on 3 night classes, it precipitates the conditions necessary for that to collapse. Maybe for the better. Maybe that addiction maybe it was unhealthy, but it felt good. That's the problem, is it feels like, it can feeling like you're getting something done can feel as addictive as drugs. No question. And it doesn't even feel addictive. You're just doing it. You're in the middle of it. It's so all-consuming that it's not even something you're aware of. You're just going. Morning to, dusk to dawn, you're going. And I guess by noticing how the things that lead to collapse and the things in the middle of collapse are similar. Meaning, I got addicted to, or I don't know, I got unbalanced with being out of work. And then when the work situation fell out, I had to supplant, since I couldn't work as much, I had to supplant the work addiction with another one, the imbalance with another. It's the imbalance, it's the positive feedback loops that get you in trouble. And so really what you have to do is you have to, when you survive, if you survive, I hope you do, you have to notice, you have to pay close attention to what it looks like in your case. Do you remember how it felt the moment you started watching all those YouTube videos? Do you remember how it felt when you did it for 2 days? Do you remember how the feeling changed? Do you remember how the numbness set in? And then can you start picking out those feelings in the future? Can you use them as warnings, as canaries in the coal mine? If you know what they feel like, if you remember closely, and if you become attuned to what exactly was the feeling, and what generally was the feeling, then you can carry that through to future situations where you get yourself in trouble, and hopefully you can do a better job of it, and you can keep evolving what you play the long game, because it's gonna happen again. And the better you are at you need to go just deep enough every time into understanding it and into experiencing it that you understand something new about yourself, but not too deep that it takes you down. If you can learn how to do that, how to play that balancing act, and how to play it better and better and better, then you're onto something. So what was your question, Mom?
Why did you go from agriculture to addictions?
Why did I go from agriculture to addiction? What's the point? What do people who become farmers have in common with people these days who become YouTube addicts? That's a really good question. The question is good because it's part of a bigger question. We understand the world a certain way, and we silo the world, and it's served us pretty well, and you can see this all the way from looking at the way careers are structured, universities, specialization, deeper specialization through masters, even deeper through PhD, or practical specialization, being able to have one specific type of job by going to college and being very practically, viscerally adept at a certain skill set, but specialized, specialized in that skill set. That's what we like to pass on. And that ties all the way back to the way we think a lot about the world, which is with definitions, with words, it goes all the way back to language, really. I'm not trying to be here and say that is wrong. I'm trying to say that it's incomplete, and it's more and more incomplete given the circumstances we're going to face in the next few decades. And let me tell you why. The world is changing much more quickly, and there's an ethos, there's an aesthetic that's imbibed by disciples, willing or not, of the academic and of the rational and scientific mindset. And that aesthetic is very much about this is one thing and this is another thing. And these things are separate. And yes, we should engender collaboration between different disciplines, but it's collaboration between different things. And it's true that these differences we've created or we've identified, however you want to look at it, between different things in the world are useful. They're very useful. They allow things that have meaning to become things that can be influenced. They turn meaning into truth. There's meaning and there's truth. And meaning is all about what you know is the way the world works, but you don't know why. And truth is, this is how the world works, and you do know that this is why it works. And what you lose with truth is, what you lose with meaning is applicability. I can't claim that, what's a good example? If all that religious people were to do is claim that there's a God and this and that, then religion wouldn't be that useful to groups. But it's the practices, it's what that means for people and how they interact with what that meaning means in their life and how it affects their neural structures that is important to understand here. And that is the subject it shouldn't be the nature of the beliefs, it should be what those beliefs do to individuals and to groups of people that should be looked at. And the same can be said about beliefs about this is one thing and this is a separate thing. So when we talk about addiction and farming, they seem very different. The point of bringing them together is to see that the world and the things that need to be tackled in the world, the set of problems in the world is a much smaller set of things that are each much more complicated than the level at which we are currently tackling them. Meaning this, we look at the world right now and we see a million different things that need solving. We see climate change, we see addiction, we see ecological destruction, we see automation, we see fake news, we see all these different little things. And by not being stuck, because I don't want to, trust me when I say that I'm not claiming here that specialization and focus are the enemy. They are the entrance, they are the way towards mastery of many things, and they should be applauded for that, and they should be continued for that. But there's a problem that comes when that's the only way we can think about things. And the problem that comes is we can't see connections between different things happening, different problems occurring to us in the world. And when we can't see connections, we enter into two we practice and perpetuate the practice of we practice and perpetuate the practice of two problematic ways of solving problems. The first thing we do is we don't go deep enough. We don't go deep enough because there's a million different issues and we're trying to solve them at the level that they were created. We're trying to solve climate change with science. Or not necessarily, you know, what I mean is we're the solutions we have aren't enough, because they're solutions that were envisioned by the very mindsets that have led us to these problems. So we're trying to solve climate change with technology. But technology and the way that certain technology spreads in the capitalist, in the specific modality of capitalism that we are engaging in currently, the technologies that win in that modality are the technologies that are bound, whether at this moment or at further moments, to cause bigger and bigger problems. And if you want to learn more about this, you should look into the tainter curve, the tainter plus curve, which Jordan Greenhall has talked about at length. And you should look into Sapiens. That's what I was reading about Sapiens. Is we agriculture is one such technology that follows that tainter curve model in a sense. It has huge, once the more you're invested in it, the harder it is to get away from it. And it's the same for addiction. I guess that's the connection. Is we're addicted to, even if what we become addicted to is helpful and wins and is a winning strategy, it's a local maximum that leads to a global minimum. Locally, if I'm addicted to work, I become very successful, and I become driven, and I inspire people, and I move things. I make things change. That's locally. That's good. But globally in my life, the more I become addicted to work, the less healthy I become. That tends to be the case. It's not preordained that that's how it happens, but that's how it tends to manifest. And what ends up happening is I kill myself with the stress. I kill myself or I shorten my lifespan, or I shorten the quality of my life. I don't take care of my family. I am not there for my kids. I leave behind trauma for other people to work out because of my imbalance. And so that's the connection between addiction and farming. And the point of connecting addiction and farming is not just to point out how widespread these behaviors are, but at a deeper level, it's to start to get used to thinking about things not as a bunch of separate problems, but as a handful of very complex or complicated problems. If climate change was different than automation as a problem, it might be easier to solve. So it's for better and for worse that there are fewer, more complex problems. It's for better in the sense that it brings a lot of clarity. I don't think in the world right now we can handle the amount of complexity, of just the sheer amount of different heads of the snakes that are popping up here, left, right, and center, all around us. Fake news, automation, the world is coming to an end. When portrayed that way, the net consequence on societies is factions and infighting, and self-destruction. So even if it was the case that there were a million different tiny problems, it might be useful to see them as a few small problems. But it just so happens to be that it's not a million tiny problems. It's a few, at most, hopefully at most a handful of very deeply embedded problems. When I say deeply embedded, I mean deeply embedded in the way humans work as biological creatures, the way humans work as social, cohesive structures, and the inheritance of that, the inertia of that. It doesn't change overnight, and there's layers to how quickly it changes and how quickly it can change, and what makes it inertialize, what makes it more flexible. And so just by the fact of connecting problems that are disparate, that seem disparate at first glance, that seem opposite at first glance, you can do way more to solve them than you can ever do by tackling them individually. That's the point of this. If I was to say it in one sentence, let's understand the problems of the world in their commonalities. Let's understand them as symptoms of a few fundamental flaws in our approach to life as individuals and to life as collectives. And if we can do that, we're much closer to knowing what's necessary. And the closer we are to that, the closer we are to action on that. And the more we stick to understanding them as all these little facets, as all these little individual things, then the more we practice tackling them in ways that just make them worse, or that definitely don't make them much better. That's it.